I've asked Chief Financial Officer John Thomas to provide an update on our financial performance this year, as well inform about proposed fiscal 17 budget. John's presentation is behind tab 6. John?
Thank you. So in summary, I'll start with the, I'll look at the update for 2016, so I'll cover that relatively high level, the first 3 quarters of performance, then I'll go through the plan and the recommended rate action that Bill mentioned in his report as well. Beginning first with our performance through the first 3 quarters of the year. Overall net income of $572 million, so that's $331 million better than planned. It did start out as a challenging year with such a mild winter. We have had, I would say, a very hot winter by traditional standards, although not as peaky as Bill mentioned. So a lot of energy uses, most of that will show up in the fourth quarter results, though, I'll say. So overall, operating revenue is below plan. However, operating expenses are below plan as well, and that's where you end up with more net income. And I'll cover some of the details on the income statement next. You can see the $325 million below plan from a revenue perspective. If you look at fuel and purchase power, just that line item itself has more than offset the impact of the base revenue at $348 million. Our O&M, $24 million ahead of plan. So we had achieved last year more than the $500 million worth of reduction, and what you see in this plan is our ability to sustain that. I'll talk more about how we progress on that going forward. But depreciation and interest expense are favorable. Some large portion of that is due to the fact that Watts Bar 2 has not come online yet, and therefore it's not commercially operationally technically, and so we're not depreciating it, and we're still capitalizing the interest. And so that's driving some of the income statement results that aren't cash items in the plan. But overall, $331 million ahead of plan, as I said, $572 million with the net income. In terms of the statement of cash flows, this is where you begin to see the netting out of the cash and non-cash items. So overall, still a good year at $76 million ahead of plan on operating cash flow. And this shows the real bottom line impact of how we've reduced expenses to address the lower revenues during the year. In terms of investing, still a really high year of investment. Both 2016 and 17 are very large years as we're finishing these construction projects, but almost $2.3 billion worth of investment so far. And with more favorable operating cash flow and slightly less capital spending, we did less borrowing so far this year than what we had anticipated. And so we're in good shape with our overall debt and total financing obligations at $533 million ahead of plan. We had strong performance in the fourth quarter of last year. Some of that carried into this year, and then you see the impacts of this year. So also $288 million less than last year. So that's where you see the overall trend towards debt reduction. So I'll pause before I move into the budget and see if there's any questions on the year-to-date performance.
Would you talk a little bit about the debt trajectory? That, you know, that's a huge item with me, is how we're moving on that score.
Sure. So we put together the, back in 2013, if you remember, that was the original plan to reduce our overall debt trajectory to the low 20s out in the early 2020s. And so far this year, and I'll show as I get into the business plan a bit on that trajectory, is that we're trending ahead of plan so far. The strong results that we've had from the last several years with weather and more cost reductions, all of that money went into debt reduction. And so what you see, that's where you see that we're ahead of plan. Okay, well, I'll move into the budget presentation then. And so first and foremost, what the budget serves for us as an alignment tool for the organization, so that we have everybody focused on the key elements of the mission, both in terms of energy, environment, and economic development. And the way we do that is by building business plans around our long-term objectives that are in line with the strategic imperatives that Bill's outlined in his president's report. So this chart represents the original plan that was put together, that we're still tracking towards, that shows us reducing our debt to $21.8 billion in 2023. And it shows that that would include modest rate increases of roughly 1.5% over this period, as long as our rates remain competitive. So that was the base plan. Next chart, please. This chart superimposes the blue line, which is what our current forecast would look like. So based off 3 years of results, new developments, you can see that on the left side, we are tracking better than the original debt reduction plan. So $19.8 billion would be our current estimate, and generally in line from a rate perspective that you see on the right side of the screen. However, I did want to spend just a minute and talk about, while it may look like everything's rosy and $2 billion ahead in terms of this long-term projection, there are some significant risks that we've seen materialize over the last 3 years as well. And so, next slide, please. This chart shows you in a waterfall format that the changes that took us from the 21.8 to the 19.8 in 2023. And it starts on the left side that we changed the amount of cash that we were holding, and we took $1 billion that we had in cash and used it to reduce debt. We also exceeded the overall, the weather, the nice hot, cold weather that we had the last 2 winters. We took all that revenue, used it to pay down debt. That's $700 million. The O&M reductions, where we exceeded what our original plan targets were, contributes another $1 billion in debt reduction over this period. And then lastly, because we used all of those previous funds to pay down debt at an accelerated rate, we have lower interest expense over the period as well. And that contributes another $1.5 billion. However, because of revisions to load forecasts and the impacts of efficiency standards, we have lost $2.2 billion worth of base revenue that we otherwise would have had in the plan. And so while we end up in somewhat better position, the first 4 items that were positive are going to be difficult to repeat in the future if we should have future erosion of baseload revenue. And when I get later in the plan, I want to talk about that, because I do think that we are going to be under pressure from a base revenue perspective, and it will require us as an organization to continue to be very focused on our efficiency efforts. I did put in a slide. I don't think in the public forums I have traditionally focused as much on the balance sheet, but given Director Maharon's comments before about wanting to improve TVA's overall capital structure, I thought it was appropriate. The one thing I wanted to highlight on this chart, this is a look at our balance sheet in 2013 when we started this effort versus 2023, and just to focus on the amount of equity within the business. As Pete mentioned, $5.6 billion was where we started, and the current trajectory has us at $17 billion up worth of equity, and that gets us to where our total capital over total liabilities reaches 50%. I don't want to confuse that with a debt to equity that's over total liabilities, but you can see a significant improvement in the overall capital structure, and this generates, with our current interest rate assumptions, somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 to $500 million worth of incremental savings for our customers. And so, as I stated up front, the original plan was put together. It assumed that we would do 1.5% base rate increases as long as our rates remain competitive. And so we do every year look at what our rate competitiveness is, and on the left side of this chart you can see our retail rates. The top of the chart shows our retail rates relative to the utility peers in our region, and the bottom relative to the top 100 utilities in the country. I believe Bill mentioned this in his president's report as well. We're in 31st position relative to the top 100. When the original plan was put together, we were in 36th position, and that rate was 9.09 cents, and now it's at 9 cents. And so we have improved our competitiveness to 31st, and we've actually reduced the rate over this period. A similar story on the right side when you look at industrial rates. And so we're 15th position now. We were 16th position when we started that. And the rate at that point was 5.83 cents. So we have reduced our industrial rates and improved that competitiveness by almost 5% over this period. I think later on you'll see some of the results that say that the impact of that on the economic development has been very beneficial for us as well. So I would say, as I move into the budget part of the presentation, that this is a budget that's in line with the long-range objectives. It meets the goals that you set for us over the long term, and we do continue at a much greater rate than we had anticipated to improve our overall competitiveness in the rates. And so I thought I would start the focus on the detailed budget for 2017 by looking at the cost structure. The cost structure meaning what are the items that go through rates and build up in our rate making, and that's on the left side of the slide. You can see fuel and purchase power, the single largest item, at $3 billion, tied with O&M, that now is at $3 billion. Then you can see interest expense. As Pete mentioned, that's 14% of our overall rate element. 4% on tax equivalents, 13% in debt service, that's the paying down of the debt. And then lastly, base capital, which is the maintenance capital that goes into our facility. The right side of the equation here is the capacity expansion and environmental projects that are predominantly funded through debt. And so I wanted to talk for a minute about load. I introduced this idea that we had lost $2.2 billion worth of base revenue over the forecast because of changing expectations for load. This chart gives you an idea of how every time we look at our load forecast, it seems to be lower and lower. I don't know, maybe I should stop looking at the load forecast if that would make a difference. But the brown bars show you weather normalized history. So we've had no load growth over the last 5 years. And our current long-range forecast, before the impacts of our efficiency programs, says that we'll be at 0.3%. After you put in efficiency, we'll be flat. And I would tell you that the risk around this are that there's much more downside risk than there is upside opportunity relative to this plan. And so that's really the reality that we need to align ourselves to. Next slide. And so what's driving this? What's been happening? This chart shows you the DOE standards and efficiency space that have been issued. And so you have the x-axis here representing time. The color of the bubbles, there's a legend that shows where these are impacting us. The orangest color being lighting, which we don't know about the lighting standards that have been out there. The size of the bubble represents the impact of that standard on electricity utilization. And so our estimates are that the large orange bubble of lighting, if you look at them, that could be as much as 4 to 6% reduction in our absolute load. The large green bubble that you see at the bottom right, the packaged commercial AC, we have not fully put into our forecast because that's something that came out recently. And you can see it's as big as the lighting is. And so I fully expect the next time that I present load forecast to you, I'll be showing an even lower, potentially negative load growth scenario. So within that, just to talk a minute about the sectors, we've had a really strong economy over the last 5 to 7 years, even here in the Tennessee Valley. And while we've had population growth, we've had growth in customer counts, overall for residential, the efficiency efforts have offset that, and we've seen flat loads for residential, and we expect that flatness to continue. The dotted part of this line shows you what our forecast is. And that's the same for small commercial and industrial. Increase in customer count, reductions in absolute usage resulting in relatively flat load. The one bright spot underneath this plan is the amount of economic development effort. I alluded to that earlier. When you look at the improvement in our industrial rate competitiveness and the work that John Bradley and his team do, I think has done a tremendous amount of impacting. As you can see, we do expect over the short term that we'll have positive growth overall in the large commercial and industrial. And so when you look over the short term, the next 3 years, you take all of that input, what it says is we're expecting slightly better load growth projections in the short term than what I showed you over the long term. And this shows you our peak growing and our energy at roughly 0.5 to 0.6% before the efficiency efforts. So that would be roughly a 0.4 to 0.3% absolute growth. just slightly better than what we project over the long term. We take this load and energy growth and run it through our rate schedules to get what our overall revenue projections would be. And so this plan recommends or calculates revenue at $10.4 billion. Then behind this, the large spending items, I just thought I'd spend a minute and walk through those. In particular here, what you can see is for fuel and purchase power. The shaded stacked bars represent the type of fuel, the bottom brown being coal, green being nuclear. What you can see is as we have begun to retire coal units, as you would expect, you see a reduction overall in the amount of coal. Then you see the green get bigger when you get into 2017, 18, 19. That's the impact of Watts Bar 2 coming online. And then at the top, probably the other notable changes, you can see the orange as we bring on the gas plants at Paradise and Allen, greater gas usage. So $3 billion worth of fuel and purchase power. That's a reduction of, if you look up here, about almost $1 billion. About half of that $1 billion reduction in fuel and purchase power was volume related and price. The other half is really improving the performance of our fleet. So really, the efficiency and effectiveness of operating the fleet, particularly the low-cost units, has resulted in about $500 million worth of savings for our customers. And so I thought I'd spend just a minute and go a little bit deeper in terms of the fuel and purchase, the purchase power element of that. We talked quite a bit about the fuel elements that go into our plants, but we do purchase a considerable amount of power as well. This chart gives you a breakout on the left side. It shows you the amount of gigawatt hours we purchase. And on the right side, it shows you how much we spend. And so of our $3 billion fuel and purchase power budget, $1 billion of that, so a third of that, comes in the purchase power arena. If you look from the bottom, a large portion of this comes from contracted, long-term contracted natural gas plants that are in the valley. And then as you move up the stack, these are placed in terms of the average rate of the cost of these items, if you think about it that way. So the SEPA hydro contract, which is the cheapest, and then you move up the stack. But you can see that we have significant commitments in terms of both the wind and the solar areas as well, with the solar continuing to grow, I would say. So overall, this gives you a perspective from a volumetric as well as from a overall financial commitment that you see both in the purchase power but also in specifically renewables. From an O&M perspective, I mentioned, I think last year, that we had exceeded the $500 million and had achieved $600 million reduction. This plan over the 3-year period holds our O&M flat. And so next slide, Todd. But just to focus for a minute underneath, what does it mean for us to hold O&M flat? And so we would anticipate labor escalation, that's wage increases for the employees that work at TVA, would be about $71 million in 2017. The agreements that Rebecca covered relative to the pension plan, TVA is increasing its financial commitment by $63 million. So that's taking the 275 to 300, as well as when you move the employees to a 401k, the 401k matching contribution comes out of TVA's budget, not out of the TVAR plan assets. And so that makes up the difference. So overall, $63 million worth of more commitment that we're making to the pension plan, and an increase in our overall EE&DR commitment year over year as well. And so in order for us to remain flat, over $100 million worth of efficiency efforts that the employees at TVA have to generate next year. The capital plan, I mentioned both, I guess the last 3 years have really been our largest capital years ever, with the completion of Watts Bar 2, the clean air projects, as well as the gas plants. We would expect 2017 to be the last really large year, and we would move back to roughly $2 billion worth of investment going forward. When that happens, that's when you'll begin to see an acceleration in TVA's overall debt reduction. So next slide, please, Todd. And so this chart shows you our overall total financing obligations, and you can see the blue bars as you get out into 18 and 19, where those TFOs begin to drop. And that's directly in line with the original plan that we had put together. Just one last comment relative to the total financing obligations. While overall we're on a trajectory of reducing our debt, we have more debt that matures in any one year than the absolute amount of debt reduction. So we would still be active in the capital markets. We would still be issuing power bonds. They just won't be as much as they otherwise would be. Sometimes that's confusion about if we're reducing debt, why are we issuing power bonds? But the net of the maturities and what we're issuing would actually result in the reduction of the debt. So just to summarize from the rate outlook, this chart shows what our projected 2017 income statement would look like. And you can see $637 million worth of net income. Then when you break that down and look at it on a revenue requirements, this is the most critical part of us building our overall budget in the year. The items at the top represent things that must be paid for through rates. And so those are the items I've covered, from fuel to O&M to capital, et cetera. And so there's $10,220 million worth of cash needs for the business. Under base revenue and fuel, we run our current load projections through our current rate schedules. And in order to achieve $10.22 billion worth of revenue, we would need $192 million more dollars. And that's what leads us to the recommendation for the roughly 1.5% at retail rate increase. We actually solved this we need 192. And so that's the way we're applying this. At the bottom, you can also see the strategic capital. That was the expansion capital and the environmental projects of $1.7 billion netted against the debt pay down. So you would see a slight increase of $374 million in this last big year of capital spending. I wanted just for a minute to back up. I know that was a lot of information about all the details relative to the budget, and kind of give a broader perspective of the track record over the last several years since we put this plan in place. Bill alluded to this in his president's report, is when we started this, our wholesale rate was at 6.9 cents. And this plan achieves 6.6 cents in 2017. So an absolute reduction in the rate that our customers are paying. And then you can see even over the 3-year period that's in this plan, we're still lower in the 2019 time period than when we started. And the way we've achieved that, you begin to see on the right side of the page, aligning our non-fuel O&M as we've done, taking out the $600 million and the incremental $100 million of efficiency that's in there for each of the next 3 years. So our O&M becomes in line with what our peers spend in terms of running their fleets. At the bottom, you can see the fuel and purchase power, the reduction from $23 to $19. When we started this at $23, we were the best amongst our peers in terms of fuel and purchase power from a rate perspective. And we've simply improved our competitiveness there well above our peers by the work that's been done over the last several years on the fleet. And then on the bottom left, one of the pieces that I like the most is we've invested $19 billion in capital and actually reduced our overall total finance obligations by $300 million. And so that's going to be the long-term sustainable path to financial health for us. So in summary, this does recommend a retail rate increase. It does achieve our long-term debt reduction goals. It funds the $2.8 billion last rather significant year of capital investment. And it does require us to generate over $100 million worth of productivity in our O&M. And then the last item I wanted to touch on that was mentioned earlier relative to the budget and our recommendations around overall rates is that we do have a request that the current real-time energy rate that is applicable in Georgia that currently exists for greenfield facilities be expanded for new load competition for brownfield facilities in order for us to be able to retract new load in the North Georgia area. And that was spoken to earlier by Greg Williams as well. And so there's a significant number of items included in the budget package itself. There's the absolute budget itself, which includes the fuel and contracting plan, $3 billion worth of bond authority for power bonds that are only issued after notification of the Finance Committee. It includes the specific over $50 million capital projects that require board approval, the land condemnations associated with transmission projects, all the items that we use regulatory accounting treatment for, of which there are no new items included. This is just a continuance of the items that we have previously used. $192 million of rate adjustment effective October 1st, and the modification to the real-time energy rate that I mentioned. So, you happy to answer any questions?
Anybody have any questions for John? John, I have one, I'll get into it, we'll be dealing with it in a bit. But that 1.5% rate increase that we've been doing, how does that compare with others in the industry? I would think that's improving our overall position, but I don't know that.
Yeah, it actually is. We, in 2013, had a 4% gap to top quartile with our peers. And we now have a 2% gap to top quartile. So we've cut in half the distance we are from top quartile, in spite of the fact that we've done 3 years of 1.5% rate increase, which means that our peers are increasing their rates faster than what we are.
Okay.
And I think a big part of that is what we've done in terms of improving our overall operational performance. And so we've been able to offset. We had expected our rates would actually rise. We did not expect that they would decrease over this 3-year period. And so current projections are that we would reach top quartile in roughly 2018.
Apologize for the phone. Okay. Well, thank you, John.